As America entered the 1820s, we had been going through a period known as the Era of Good Feeling. The Federalist Party had died off because they had not supported the War of 1812. So we apparently had no opposition party at that time. Everyone apparently was in the same political party. And during that time period, Henry Clay's American system tried to encourage the different sections of the country to work together for the common good. However, the election of 1824 is about to start drawing the curtain on the era of good feeling and moving us into the era of Jackson. In 1824, with no clear political parties, we have several people running for office. We have William Crawford, who is in favor of more power in the hands of the states. He's a states' rights candidate. We have both Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams both running as really as nationalists. They both are in favor of the American system. They both are in favor of the country working together to achieve common goals. And then nominated by the legislature of Tennessee, you have a war hero, Andrew Jackson. Now, because there's four major candidates in this election, none of them received a majority of the electoral votes. The votes were split between four candidates. Now, Jackson did get the most votes. However, he doesn't have at least 50% plus one. So therefore, the election then, according to the Constitution, goes to the Congress. And they take the top three vote-getting candidates from the Electoral College and they choose a winner. Now, in this case, the Congress was split on which of these top three candidates, Crawford, Adams, or Jackson, that they would pick to be president. Now, the fourth candidate who was not up for election in Congress was Henry Clay. And since he was not on that list anymore because they only take the top three candidates, he eventually, not surprisingly, throws his support behind a guy who had very similar ideas as his, John Quincy Adams. And so Adams ends up with the support of Clay in Congress, getting the votes and becoming our next president. Now, because Clay helped Adams get those votes, and then Adams turned around and made Clay the next Secretary of State, which was a very important position, a lot of his opponents, especially Andrew Jackson and his supporters, accused Adams and Clay of a corrupt bargain, saying that, hey, Adams told Clay, I'll make you Secretary of State if you get me these votes. So it ends up right from the start, Adams' administration is viewed unfavorably by Jackson. His supporters feel like he rightfully won that election because he got the most electoral votes. And so throughout his whole administration, Jackson supporters are just waiting for the next election so they can defeat Adams and make him the president. And so there's a lot of opposition to Adams throughout his presidency. Adams' presidency is fairly unremarkable. Almost every college level textbook I've taught out of over the years has had one, maybe two paragraphs on his entire administration, usually just one, and usually a very short paragraph. He really doesn't accomplish much as president. He has some very out there ideas for America. He wants to establish a national university and a national observatory and other ideas that just really weren't in step with with most Americans. And so he doesn't end up having a lot of support as the next election comes around. Jackson, now supported by this new Democratic Party that is formed around him, ends up winning the election. And this new party that is formed, the Democratic Party, is this growing out of the old Democratic Republican Party. The supporters of Jackson formed this new party. And this is the beginnings of our modern Democratic Party. From this point on, the Democrats will continue throughout our history, right up to the present, to be one of the two major parties in this country. Now, we don't have a clear opposition party formed yet. So throughout Jackson's administration, we're going to see a new opposition party to the Democrats form, and that will eventually be the Whig Party, which we'll see more about in just a little bit here. So Jackson becomes president in 1828. And when we talk about this being the age of Jackson, it's a period where the common man is gaining more and more of a voice in the country. By the 1830s, by the time Jackson's president, most states had given up any kind of property right for free men to vote. And so now the poorest men, if they're free men, we still have not given the right to vote to slaves. We still have slavery. Women still do not have the right to vote. But still, this is a big step. Any free man is going to be able to vote and have a say in the government. So this is a great extension of democracy. And Jackson himself represents the common man in many ways. He is a war hero. He's from the West. He wasn't born rich. He ended up having to work his way up. He became a general and became famous that way. He also ended up actually marrying a fairly wealthy woman. His wife, Rachel, she was from a wealthy family, and she had actually been married before she married Jackson, but she had divorced her first husband, and when Jackson married her, he had married into wealth. And so he is among the new rich in the South. He owns a plantation. He is prosperous. He is a war hero. But being a Westerner and being a fairly rough sort of fella, in many ways he appeals to the common American. Now, the way that he ends up running his administration, there's a story about him that really kind of sums up the way he's going to be as president. Jackson was involved in a number of duels in his lifetime, and the most famous of them was a duel with a man named Charles Dickinson. Dickinson had made a bet with Jackson on a horse race, and there was a disagreement about that bet. On top of that, Dickinson had made some insulting comments about Jackson's wife, Rachel. Now, sadly, Rachel's going to take a lot of flack in her lifetime for the fact that she got divorced and then married Jackson. Remember, divorce back then was not an acceptable thing. Also, the divorce might not have actually legally have gone through at the time that she married Jackson. She thought it had, but it really had not. And so there's some questions about this, and her honor was questioned by this Dickinson fella. Now, Jackson was always a very hot-headed sort of fella, and when this guy not only has a dispute with him over a horse race, but has insulted his wife, who he loved very much, Jackson decided he would kill this man in a duel. Now, that's the key thing. He would kill him in a duel. Duels do not have to be fought to the death. A duel is an affair of honor where both sides meet each other on a field. In America, we typically dueled with pistols, and each man would typically stand on either end of the field, possibly start back-to-back and walk off the paces, but they would face each other, and with seconds, their friends acting as their duly appointed referee, basically, for the duel. They would administer it. It would be done honorably. Both men would exchange shots, and if no one was shot at all, they could walk away with honor. They had proved they were brave men, and so, you could end a duel without anybody being shot. Or if one person gets shot, the duel could end there. It doesn't necessarily have to end with the death of anyone. You're proving that you're an honorable man, that you're not a coward, and many duels ended with the two sides making up without anyone dying. However, Jackson wants to kill this man, and Jackson decides that he's not going to be able to kill this man if he gets in a hurry. The man he had chosen to duel with, Dickinson, was known to be one of the best shots in Tennessee. And Jackson knows if he hurries, this guy is likely to get off a good shot, and if he hurries, he'll miss. So Jackson decides, before the duel, that he is going to let Dickinson shoot first. He'll hold his shot until Dickinson is fired. That way he can take his time, make deadly aim, and kill this man. And that is what happens. Jackson, on the day of the duel, he allows Dickinson to fire first. They could both fire at the same time, but he just waits, lets Dickinson fire, and he's hoping that Dickinson firing quickly will not kill him. And Dickinson nearly did. He just missed his heart by barely an inch. And where the bullet ended up lodging near his spine, it was so bad that the doctors couldn't take it out. It would stay in his body the rest of his life and cause him pain the rest of his life. But that was okay with Jackson. He took a bullet, and then he was able to stand there, take deliberate aim, and put a bullet through Dickinson's heart and kill him dead. This is Jackson. This is how he'll be as president. It doesn't matter what it costs him. Jackson's going to win every encounter he has. And we're going to see that sort of attitude. No matter what it costs him, he's got to win. And we're going to see him do that with every single issue that he faces as president, for better or for worse. There will be several significant battles that Jackson is going to wage while he is president. One of those is over Indian removal. Now, in the state of Georgia, there was a particular group of Indians, the Cherokee, who had done their very best to actually try to live at peace with the Americans. They had adopted many of our ways. They were farmers. They lived in little settlements. They had a chief by the name of Sequoyah had created a language for them so they could have write newspapers and write documents. And they had done everything they could to fit in and to live at peace with us. But unfortunately, the land that they had developed was very tempting to other settlers in Georgia. And when gold was discovered on some of their land, people had to have that land. So under a new law which the United States passed called the Indian Removal Act, plans were made to force the Indians to leave their land and move further west. Well, the Cherokees fought in a way that no Indian had ever fought. They took it to court. And they argued their case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to remove the Indians from their land, that they had a right to stay. Now, the problem is with this, the person who is to enforce federal law is the President of the United States. And the President is not in favor of keeping them on the land there in Georgia. He would like to see them moved further west. And so when he hears that the Supreme Court, led by John Marshall, have made their ruling, he is supposed to have said, John Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. In other words, as president, Jackson is not going to stand in the way of Indian removal. He will ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court and allow it to take place anyway. Now, there's two different ways to look at this. You could look at this as a breakdown of our system of government where the president is refusing to do his job, and the law, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, is not being followed. However, you could also look at it as this is the check and balance system in action. Jackson, the president, is refusing to carry out an unpopular ruling by one of our branches of government, and the will of the American people is behind him. Now, if Jackson had been out of step with the will of the American people, then Congress could have brought him up on charges, possibly impeached him. But that doesn't happen because the American people want the Indians removed. Now, it's a horrible thing from our perspective today, what they're wanting and what's going to happen. But at the time, it was the will of the American people. And by refusing to act, Jackson was carrying out the will of the American people by forcing the Indians to move further west. Sadly, what is going to happen then is the Cherokee will be ordered to give up their lands, to give up their homes, and it will take several years to accomplish this, but eventually what happens will be known as the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokees are forced to move further west to Indian territory, and many will die. They'll be forced to move, unfortunately, a very badly run operation. They'll be forced to move during the winter, and it just will be a horrible tragedy. But Jackson got his way, regardless of the cost, the Indians were forced to move. Now, another showdown that Jackson has was a very serious one that led us to the edge of civil war. The Tariff of Abominations, as it was called, had been passed right before Jackson came into office. This very high protective tariff benefited northern businesses, but down south it didn't benefit Southerners. The fact of the matter was, this would help protect Northerners by putting a very high price on foreign imports, but Southerners might, in some cases, be forced to pay this. Plus, the South mostly shipped their cotton either to the North or overseas to Europe, and if we're going to tax imports, it might hurt Southern exports. So the South is not in favor of this tariff. South Carolina decides that they have the right to nullify any law that the federal government, the central government, passes that they think is just unjust or unconstitutional. Therefore, in the state of South Carolina, they're not going to collect that tariff. Now, this is directly challenging the authority of the United States government and the President of the United States, who is supposed to enforce this tariff. Now, Jackson isn't a big fan of northern businesses or tariffs, but Jackson is the president, and he will enforce the law. And he is certainly not a fan of anybody who is undermining the power of his government or threatening the unity of our country. And South Carolina is threatening just that. So the vice president at the time was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Vice President Calhoun and some of these Southern congressmen invite Jackson to a celebration commemorating Washington's birthday, hoping to kind of schmooze him and also put some pressure on him to side with them. And during this banquet, Jackson is invited to give a speech. And so he stands up in front of people who are definitely trying to pressure him into siding with them, and he gives a toast to the Union. It must be preserved. And he's right in their face. I ain't putting up with your foolishness. We're keeping this country together. Well, his vice president, John C. Calhoun, stands up and replies to that toast by lifting his glass and saying, "To the Union, next to our rights most dear." He states rights. He's not standing with Jackson. So very publicly, the president and vice president take opposite sides on this issue. It's not long after this that John C. Calhoun will resign as vice president and go down south and become the leading senator from the South, pushing the Southern point of view and defending their ideals in Congress right up until just before the Civil War. So Jackson has made his position very clear. He is not going to tolerate nullification. South Carolina is dug in, and they set the date where they're going to stop collecting the tariff. And Jackson says, if you guys don't do your job, if you nullify this law, I'll come down to South Carolina and I'll hang every one of you by the nearest tree. And he's not playing. He'll do it. That's the kind of man Jackson is. Fortunately, there's our old friend Henry Clay. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, steps in and he works out a deal. And he says, hey, South Carolina, you know he ain't messing with you. He'll come down here and do it. You're going to start a civil war. You better bend. You got to do what he wants. But maybe we went a little high with this tariff. Maybe we can give you some help here. So why don't we do this? You guys enforce the tariff. You have to. But if you'll enforce the tariff now, we'll vote to reduce the tariff. And every few months, we'll reduce the tariff again and again until it's gone. If you guys will just not have a civil war now with Jackson. And so Jackson's happy. He was able to force them to take up the tariff. South Carolina gets what they want. The tariff eventually goes away, and civil war is averted. But Jackson, he wasn't going to bend on this issue. Jackson's going to win regardless of the cost. Well, Jackson, as he's moving towards his second term of office, his political enemies come up with an idea how to get rid of him. Henry Clay doesn't like Jackson, neither does Daniel Webster, the great politician of the North, and neither does a fellow by the name of Nicholas Biddle, who is the head of the Bank of the United States. Now, Jackson's not a big fan of big business or banks. He doesn't trust them. And all of these guys got together and they said, hey, you know what? Jackson doesn't like the Bank of the United States. And if there were to be a bill go across his desk to recharter the bank, he would veto it. Jackson was famous for vetoing. He had vetoed more laws than any other president ever had. And they knew they could get him to veto a rechartering of the Bank of the United States. The only problem was the bank didn't come up for recharter for many years. But they figured, let's try to recharter early. That way, this will go across his desk. He'll veto it before the election. Everyone will know that he has a bad sense of business and he's bad for the country, and he'll lose the election. So Nicholas Biddle puts in to recharter the bank. And the bill comes across Jackson's desk. And see, the thing is, Jackson's not stupid. He knows exactly what they want him to do. But he ain't going to be cowed. He vetoes it anyway. Then he wins the election. Well, after that, he's ticked because of what they had tried to pull. Now, the thing is, the bank still has a charter for a number of years, but Jackson's not going to wait. The bank messed with him, he's going to mess with the bank. And so what he does, he can't destroy the bank, outright ban it. But what he can do as president is he can move our funds around. And so he withdraws a bunch of money from the Bank of the United States, and he puts it in the Bank of Maryland. Then he withdraws a bunch of money from the Bank of the United States, and he puts it in the Bank of Virginia. And he keeps doing that, pulling out money until the bank is bankrupt. And all those little banks that got the money that was the Bank of the United States, they called them his pet banks. Well, he took all the money out of the Bank of the United States, and he bankrupted it because they had messed with him, so he destroyed them. Now he won his little battle, and that's going to bring on a little event called the Panic of 1837, a financial crisis, which is going to ruin his successor, Martin Van Buren. It was a really dumb move. He wrecked the economy. But that didn't matter. He won. And that's what Jackson had to do, was win. So Jackson crushes the bank. He finishes his second term of office before the financial crisis hits. But ultimately, the man he handpicks, Martin Van Buren, he will inherit the bad economy and get the blame for the Panic of 1837. Now, in the meantime, there's been growing opposition to Jackson. But Jackson's just hard to beat. He knows how to win an election. He's a man of the people. Well, this new growing political party that's going to oppose the Democrats is called the Whigs. They're a fiscally conservative party that shares similarities with a party in England called the Whig Party, and this is where they get their name. And that party did get their name from the powdered wigs that they wore almost a century before. So if you ever wonder, did the Whig Party get its name from the powdered wigs? No, they didn't directly. They got their name from the one in England that did get it from the powdered wigs. But this Whig Party, they know they're going to have to beat Jackson. So they start trying to find a way to win. And they figure, well, Jackson knows how to win. We need to copy his model. So Van Buren gets elected president in 1836. In 1840, he'll be up for re-election. And by then, the Whigs have it figured out. What was Jackson? He's a war hero. He's from the West. He was born a simple man in a cabin. He is a man of the people. This is what we have to have. So the Whigs started looking really hard for a war hero. And it's been a while since we had a war. They had to go all the way back to the War of 1812, back to a fellow who fought the Indians out west. From Indiana, they found a fellow by the name of William Henry Harrison. And by this time, he's a really old fellow. But he was born out west in a log cabin. And he was a man of the people and a Westerner. And the way they campaigned, this is considered the first modern political campaign, is his supporters go around giving speeches. And one of the big things back then was passing out alcohol at political rallies. That was a major feature of political rallies early in our country's history. And they had coins which represented him as a man of the people by showing on the back of the coin the log cabin he was born in, and right next to it a little keg of whiskey. And they wrote songs about him, and they really had a slick campaign, and they had a little campaign slogan: Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Harrison was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, and his vice presidential candidate, a moderate who would win over some middle ground voters by the name of John Tyler, was his vice presidential candidate. Thus the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Well, in the election of 1840, with Van Buren looking weak because of the financial panic which had ensued, thanks to Jackson's actions, actually, Harrison ends up winning. And so Harrison becomes our oldest president. The problem is when Harrison gets inaugurated, he wants to show everyone he is fit and energetic and able to do the job. So he decides, instead of riding in a carriage, he'll walk down Pennsylvania Avenue on the day of his inauguration, shake hands with the crowd, and then give his speech, which turns out to be the longest speech anyone had ever given. And the problem was it was a cold, rainy day, and he did just what he said he was going to do, and he caught pneumonia, and he died shortly after entering office. So he was president for less than a month. He's dead. And now, for the first time in American history, a vice president succeeds the president. And the problem was, for the Whig Party, they had picked as their vice presidential candidate a man who didn't really truly share all of their values. So John Tyler ends up becoming the vice president, and he squabbles and argues with the leaders of the Whig Party because he won't do things their way. And so he doesn't get along with the Whigs. He doesn't get along with the Democrats. Pretty much everyone hates him. And he gets himself thrown out of his own political party midway through his term of office. So this guy, John Tyler, on many levels is just a disaster as a president. But there's one big thing that he's trying to get accomplished. About this time, as we're going to look at in the next section, Texas had become independent of Mexico and was trying to join the Union. And John Tyler did his best to get Texas into the Union. And so, as we'll see in the next unit, eventually that is going to happen as America is looking west, looking to expand, looking to settle more territory, to add more territory in Texas and in the Northwest. And eventually, we're going to see the size of the U.S. greatly expand during the next President Polk's term of office.